Hello, and welcome to episode 134 of the Casual Try Hard podcast. I'm Brian.
And I'm James.
And this week we're going to continue our Playing in Paper series, and we're going to look at how to shortcut your way through the turn. Not like skip anything super important, but like how you can maneuver around more effectively.
Yeah, it's not like your opponent just cast an Elrond's Epiphany and you just skip your whole turn, but how to like reasonably work turn in paper, because Arena does a lot of that stuff for you, stops and such. So
yeah,
we're going to talk about how to do that stuff like verbally with your opponent and how much information is expected to be like transferred back and forth. So if you guys have any, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you have any suggestions, right, you can get us on Twitter at Casual Tripod. Real quick.
Sorry about that. I almost stole your thunder.
Yeah, and we have we had a new Twitter follower from Denmark. I think it was Denmark. Ooh. We are like worldwide diversified.
Wow, yeah.
That's,
that's our first one. I don't know anybody from Denmark.
Yeah, that's not South Carolina, so we're moving out in the world.
That is true. Aside from Twitter, you can hit us up on Facebook at CasualTryHardMTG, or you can drop us an email, show@CasualTryHardMTG.com. If you guys have, any questions about how to get through a turn, or if you had any feedback about some of the other episodes in this series, or if there's things that you want us to talk about in the upcoming episodes. I think I have maybe 6-ish episodes left until we're done with this whole thing, and then we get to figure out how to cut it into like a giant 24-hour long episode, post it out there for the masses. That should be fun.
Yeah, 24-hour episode. Like we could just like play it and like just take turns like doing commentary with like listeners or something. Like 24-hour streams. It could just be a 24-hour pod.
Oh man,
there we go.
I don't know if I could handle that.
Yeah, neither do I. I'm old now.
I think my talker would break.
Your talker would break.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm not much of a talker. I don't have the same practice that you do.
Fair. Years of practice.
Yeah. Also, if you guys want to support the show, we would appreciate it if you use our TCG player affiliate link, tcg.casualtryhardmtg.com. I know over the weekend I went through and made an order of stuff that I've been meaning to order from Modern Horizons 2 and a couple things from Forgotten Realms. I pretty much skipped this set, but there were a couple interesting cards that I wanted to add to my collection, so I ordered them and a bunch of stuff from MH2. And I used our TCG player affiliate link so that we get paid back for that. So anything you guys purchase after following that link, we'll get a little cut off to help keep the show going. If any of you want to support us a little bit more directly, you can do so at patreon.com/CasualTryHardMTG. Patrons get access to our pre-show. Our pre-show today was a doozy.
It was an hour and 20 minutes, and we got deep into the things happening in modern Magic design.
Yeah. Our pre-show today could have easily been an episode.
It was very good.
It was really good. Like, I kept thinking that as we were doing the pre-show that, like, people are going to miss out because this was a good, like, it could have been a good episode. So our patrons are blessed to have access to that content. If anybody else wants access to that content, throw a couple bucks in the pot. Hit us up on patreon.com/CasualTryHardMTG, and you'll get access to it as well. While we're working through this Playing in Paper series, like that kind of stuff is going to be saved for the pre-show, just because we don't have time to do it all in the actual episodes. And not just from you guys, but you guys have all been asking us Playing in Paper stuff. And we've had some outside sources kind of asking us for some of this Playing in Paper stuff. And we're also, trying to use this to grow the show some too by reaching out to local game stores and stuff. So if any of you guys have a local game store that is interested in maybe helping us get the word out about the show, or you think they could use some of these tips and tricks and, how to navigate and, best practices for a turn, whatever, hit me up in either our email or on our Discord. There's a link in the description. There's a link on social media, but jump into our Discord, send me a message. Let me know, and I'll reach out to your game store, hook them up with some swag to hopefully help promote the show a little bit too.
Yeah.
You got anything else for the intro, or into
I
this?
I don't think so. So let's get into this whole thing.
All right.
All right. So like we said, we're gonna work on how to like effectively navigate through your turn, and a lot of that relies on shortcuts. And we talked about some of them last week, but I think we're just gonna do it a little bit more in a more focused manner this week.
Yeah, a little bit more in depth and kind of talk about some of the differences. I had mentioned at the top of the show that a lot of people right now are starting to play in paper either again or for the first time after being introduced to the game digitally on Arena. And Arena holds your hand. Like as much as we complain about the interface and some of the control stuff that happens with Arena, if all you do is play on Arena, you are unfortunately going to be kind of a sloppy paper player. I know after spending the last, how long's it been, 18 months or whatever, playing basically only on Arena, my paper game is garbage. It's so bad. I'm so rusty.
Yeah, like just all the stuff you have to track and all the ways you have to communicate. You just haven't had to do it because the client was like, "Here's how much damage is marked on that creature."
Right.
And all that stuff is taken care of you.
Yeah. So, we've talked about different aspects of this in some of the other portions of this series. And like Brian said, today we're going to talk about how to get through a turn. Because in Arena, it moves through the turn for you. And you don't have to worry about any of this. You just click that end turn button and it goes right on through the end of the turn. So a lot of this is going to be about communication. Some of it is going to be some tips and tricks. But like in Arena, you don't really communicate with your opponent unless you're a savage that has your emotes on. So like communication is important. Communication is what keeps the game state correct and makes sure everybody is doing what and like allows the game to progress, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's what allows the game to happen. Right? Like you can't, like the two of you just can't sit in silence and like play cards and like turn things sideways. Like it just won't work.
Right.
Right. So, all right. So we've talked about this before, right? In the paper game, there are things that we do just to save time.
Right.
Right. And the first one is kind of the first three phases of the game. Untap, upkeep, draw. Every so often, I will like mutter these as I go through them. But for the most part, like it's just kind of one motion. You untap your cards and then you draw your card.
Right.
And so,
like on Arena, it even kind of lumps these together too, right? Because if you put a stop at the beginning of the turn, it stops. It makes a stop every priority change through the start of the main phase, right?
Yeah, like there's not a stop for the draw step per se.
Right.
Right, like there's a stop for basically the upkeep, and it's kind of put those two steps together, and it asks you to pass to the draw step.
Yeah.
And then it asks you to pass out of the draw step. But it's not like there's just like an upkeep stop and then a draw step stop. They're kind of pushed them all together.
Yep. And like we talked about last week, there's nothing you can do in the untap step anyway.
Yeah.
So it's basically just the upkeep and the draw.
It is, though, super weird, like right now, like with Blackstaff, where it does in your upkeep say, like, do you want to untap this?
Yeah.
And it's like everything's grayed out except for the Blackstaff, and you're like, oh, I guess I do have to make the decision now in my untap step.
That's right.
Right. But yeah, so if you want to do something in your opponent's upkeep, you need to stop them from drawing their card.
Yeah, if they draw their card, it's too late. There's really no way to go back.
Right. So you need to like communicate, you end your turn and then you want to kind of say like, okay, your turn, I have effects in your upkeep. You want to like let them know, or like as they're untapping, you want to say like, hey, I have effects in your upkeep. Right? Yep. Like ideally, Right. I guess the like most like waiting till they're untap and like catching them there, right, is probably the most advantageous for you
Correct.
as the player, because if they were going to do something on your end step, they might not.
Right.
Or they might do something different on your end step because you've telegraphed that you have something to do on their upkeep. But in terms of like the chances of you missing
very high.
the like the untap, especially if they're like not tapped out or something, or if they just like can like go draw their card, like it increases the chances you can miss. So
Yeah,
like,
there's also like especially at like regular rules level or at like FNM or whatever where things are a lot more casual. Like a lot of players, especially new players, don't untap first. They'll draw their card first, and then like, you know, when they go to start their turn, they'll realize they haven't untapped their land yet, and then they'll untap their lands and, you know, proceed with their main phase. So if you get one of those players and you're waiting for them to untap so that you know, stop them and say I have effects in your upkeep, like you're going to be too late because they've already drawn their card.
yeah. And, you know, what ends up happening, especially like the FNM, is like, oh, I'll untap my lands and I'll like stick my card back on top or something, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, you're playing for store credit or like a pack. Like,
Right.
there's no reason to like try to knife someone.
Right.
But at the same time, right, you do need, like, one, you need to do your stuff in the right order. Especially like coming from arena, like you need to make sure like, hey, I need to untap.
Right.
Then there's right, it's kind of like untap, like almost like take a beat, just a sec, and then draw your card to like be like, like to give your opponent time to respond. But if you need to do something in their upkeep, you need to say like, hey, this is going to happen, and like I don't know, if you leak a little information, I don't know, it's probably better than like missing your window to do the thing you needed to do.
Yeah, or like you said, you know, at FNM level play, that's probably what is going to happen is your opponent will just like put the card back on top and say, okay, go ahead, and then draw their card afterwards. Like the amount of information that you have leaked by saying I have effects during your upkeep, like on your end step, is very small compared to the amount of information that your opponent gained by looking at the top.
Yeah. By looking at the top of their deck.
Yeah.
So it's just, you know, whatever's. But just being clear and saying, hey, this is something I need to do, and I need to make sure I do it here. Right?
Yeah.
And like we talked about before, that can be something like if you have a removal spell and you think they might have a counter spell. Right? You want to do that on your upkeep, on their upkeep, I'm sorry. So you minimize the chance of them drawing a counter spell, but you tax their mana on their turn.
Right.
Or, you know, good old Elder Deep Fiend, or Misbind Click, right? If you go really old, something that like can tap lands.
Yeah.
You're like, hey, flash this in, tap your lands.
Yeah.
Right? To like try to time walk them for a turn. Right? Those are all things you have to do like on their upkeep to like maximize the effect.
Yeah. I'll also say the flip side of this, which is, you know, after the format has been played a little bit and you're kind of used to the interactions and like, you know, what's out there in the meta. A lot of times if I'm suspecting something that has like a weird timing constraint, I'll either number one, like give extra time for my opponent to do the thing, or I'll straight up ask them, like during Shadows when we had Elder Deep Fiend, like I would untap and say, are you going to Deep Fiend me?
Yeah,
and, like give them every opportunity to do so.
I mean, because honestly, you know, if you see the, you know, whatever, the 3 mana, like, draw a card creature.
Yeah.
In, like, in the blue-green deck.
Yeah.
And then your opponent's, like, and it's, like, has up 4 mana. You're like, huh, I wonder what could possibly be happening right now. Right?
Yeah.
Like, you know. It's harder when it's, like, you know, just some random pile. And you don't know to ask. But, yeah, like, you can just be like, hey, am I am I going to use all of my lands this turn?
Right.
And I can be like, yes, you get to use all of your lands this turn. Thank you, sir. Can I have another?
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah. So just like being conscientious and being like, yo, it's cool.
Yeah.
So the other thing, and we talked about this before, is getting into combat.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So going from your main phase to like declaring attackers, the official tournament shortcut is saying, I'm going to go to combat or go to combat.
Yeah.
Right? And that cuts out the beginning of combat step, which is where you have a chance to do something in combat before you declare attackers.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And we talked about, like, that's where Goblin Rabble Master makes his token. That's where
Toolcraft Exemplar gets pumped.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know, it's hard because they will say, like, we're not doing this anymore, or they will design cards that could work like that, but they change them, and then like 2 sets later they go back to the same like design that was a problem previously. So but I don't know how many cards they designed to have like beginning of combat triggers.
Right. Yeah.
Now.
A lot of times now it's like if this creature is attacking.
Yeah, do a thing.
Yeah, or when this creature attacks, do a thing.
Yeah.
Instead of at the beginning of combat.
Yeah, because I think it's an easier arena thing.
Probably.
Yeah. Because, I mean, think about, how many, like, Legion war bosses got free tokens.
Right.
Right, because for the longest time, arena would, like, they would resolve their spell and it would just pass to combat and the trigger would go on the stack. And as the non-active player, you didn't have a chance to kill it before they got to combat.
Right.
Like, if you didn't have a stop set.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, now for some cards like Legion War Boss or whatever, like, you can make it when they attack, but it makes the card fundamentally different.
Yes.
But, like, if Toolcraft Exemplar was like, when it attacks, it gets +3/+1.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It would have made it so it couldn't crew Heart. But, like, what Toolcraft Exemplar was trying to do, which is be a 4/2.
Right.
Or a 4/3 or whatever, it could have still... 3/2. It still could have done it.
Right.
Right? But this combination with Heart was weird. So if someone says go to combat, if you need to do something in their beginning of combat phase, like we talked about, like, this is where you can kill a creature and make sure they can't play a haste creature behind it.
Right.
Or, that's the big one if you're the non-active player, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the main time you do anything there.
Right.
So,
it's, again, I'm going to relate this to what we were just talking about when we were talking about like etiquette through like the first few phases of a turn, is like once you're deep into a format, you kind of already know the timing. Like for every standard format, there are certain like timing tricks that are to be learned to like play optimally, or like you can kind of expect them out of your opponent. And this beginning of combat is the same thing. Like if there's cards that are seeing play that care about the beginning of combat, it's the right thing to do to, like you said, say, move to combat and do it that way. If there's nothing in the format that cares about the beginning of combat, except for what you said, where, you're trying to kill something without like a hasty creature following it up, normally it's fine to just like say, okay, I'm going to attack with these guys. Like, I mean, that happens all the time.
Yeah. Like I said, and the thing with like you as a non-active player, if your opponent says go to combat, right, and you want to do the thing where you kill their creature in the beginning of combat, you have to, like, here's where communication is important. If you say, all right, I'm going to kill your thing.
Yeah.
Right. Where you said stop, we were still in the main phase.
Correct.
Right. So you have to be like, okay, be like, all right, I need to do something in the beginning of combat.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And make that clear that you want to go to combat, but you want to stop before declare attackers. Because you have the right to stop there. Basically, when someone says go to combat, or does any of these shortcuts, they're basically asking you, hey, is it okay if we skip some part of the turn?
Beginning of combat, yeah.
Right? So they're saying go to combat, and they're trying to get to declare attackers. And you can say, like, I need to do something here, and they have to let you wait.
Yeah, a lot of times, like if I want to kill a thing before attacks or, whatever effect you want to do, a lot of times I'll say, or my opponent will say, go to combat, and I'll say, okay, but before attacks, I'll kill this guy. I'll animate my land, or I'll tap your guy down, or whatever it is. Like, that way there's no, misunderstanding. My opponent knows that I've said, okay, which means we're no longer in the main phase. But I said, but before attacks, that means before attackers are declared. So that solidly puts everybody in beginning of combat.
Yeah. So as long as you're clear, but there is, how can I put this? There's the okay, but, like, where it's close together, where things get sketchy is if you're like, okay, but, right? If you wait too long, your opponent might feel like you are trying to, like, see what creatures you're going to reach for to attack.
Yeah.
And, like, steal information. Again, we're probably playing at F&M.
Right.
No need to do that. And if we're not playing at F&M, don't do that still. Right. I mean, you got yelled at because, like, a trigger went on the stack and it was a fight spell or something? And they're like, you waited to feed something. It was Wicked Wolf.
Yeah.
You they thought like you waited too long to do the indestructible.
Right.
Yeah. So like just making sure that things are like well paced when you say it, so people don't feel like you're trying to like eke a little bit of extra edge out of them.
Yeah. And
again, like usually at F&M, it doesn't matter as much. These are hopefully people that are your friends and that you know, and you
that will be your friends and that you will know.
Yeah, and you don't want to go in and be like, oh man, I think this guy's trying to scum me for a pack. Yeah. Like or oh man, this like $10 in store credit. Like so.
Yeah.
Just be clear, and again, I think that being clear is going to lead to people having more fun and enjoying it more.
Well, it also leads to better players. Like, that was the driving force behind me getting back into Magic, was like the quality of player that we had at the store was that it made you want to be a better player.
Yeah.
And I think like that part of the game is kind of what's missing lately, and what really bums me out about like Magic as a whole is that drive to be like a higher level, more technical player. Like there's no reason for that anymore. And that was like literally what drew me into the game.
Yeah. It is sad because like I like to do something to try to get reasonably good at it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And like that's why a lot of times like I have a hard time going back and playing like video games.
Mm-hmm.
Because like there was a point where I played this game a lot and I was really good at it. Or I felt like really good at it. And then I come back and I'm just like, oh man, I've got to relearn everything. Like, I don't want to go through all that again. Right. Whereas like Magic, it was like, oh, this is something I can like get better at. And there's like a reason to get better at. Like, playing a one player video game, there's not a real reason to get better. Right. And if Magic, Magic almost feels at times like you're playing a one player video game.
Yeah. I mean, even on Arena, where you have like an actual other player, a lot of times it's like a one-player video game.
I mean, that's what I meant. Like, you have your emotes off. It's basically a like Sparky with a better AI,
right?
And you're just like, oh, okay, I'm gonna play these games and whatever.
Yeah.
All right. So, like we said, like we keep stressing like the F&M aspect of shortcuts, right? And they're fine for F&M. They help you get back to your house at like 11 as opposed to 12.
Right.
Right? Because if you like every turn you were like, go to untap, go to upkeep. May I move to the draw phase?
Right.
Draw my card. May I move to main phase? Right. You're gonna be there forever. Right. So these things
you
just
are
have
100%
to happen.
going to time.
Yes. Right. With competitive play, right? You need to be more clear and more mindful of your shortcuts to make sure everyone knows what's going on.
Yeah, it's also easy in competitive play for like you to like catch a failure to maintain
Yes.
because of something that your opponent did.
You're talking to someone who got a failure to maintain because his opponent had 9 cards in his hand.
Right.
And it became my job in the rest of that match to ask, how many cards do you have at the end of every turn?
Because technically the game state is it's up to both players to maintain it. So if one of you is not maintaining the game state at, higher level rules, you're both at fault. It's going to work.
Yeah. So you have here err on the side of too much information. So basically communicate maybe more than you think like you should have to.
Well, just to make sure everybody's on the same page.
Exactly.
Like life totals. Whenever life totals change, if I'm playing in a reasonably competitive event, I will announce the life total changes. And I will announce what each of us are at every single time the life totals change. So because that's the number one place where like things can get gray.
Like, I'll take 5, go to 14, so I got up 14, like 14-20.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
The number of times, and the most common thing that gets missed is fetch lands.
Oh yeah.
Either
100%.
It's like I'll crack my fetch and you go get your land, and your opponent writes down the life total change, and you didn't
because you were fetching. Yeah.
Yeah, like that. And the number of times like my opponent's been like, "Oh, I have you at 13 instead of 14." I'm just like, "Oh, okay." Like, yeah, I fetched. I must just not have written it down. But this is the joy of having the paper.
Right.
Is right. Your opponent can be like, it went 20-19, then to 18. Now you're at 13, and it's like, oh, I have it 20-19, 19-14.
Yeah,
and then it's like, oh, I did miss that 1 point.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You can look in your graveyard and go like, oh, I have 2 fetch lands. I only have 1 life total, 1 life missing for my fetch. Okay, this makes perfect sense. I know what's going on.
I've had this happen a lot of times with Thoughtseize also. Being somebody that has cast a lot of Thoughtseize, I will, cast Thoughtseize, write the life total change on my paper, and then, like, while I'm looking through my opponent's hand, they'll be so concerned with, what their game plan's going to be after I take the card that they needed that they'll forget to write down the life total change. And like we said earlier, failure to maintain is for both players. So even though your opponent made the mistake with your life total, it's up to both of you to maintain that correctly.
Yeah. And like there is, like we keep saying, failure to maintain like the game state, but they are pretty lenient with that. Like I think you need like 3 of them or something for it to actually be a penalty.
Like over the course of a whole tournament. So
and like a lot of times, those are things that if you're just like, oh yeah, no, it makes sense that I like forgot to do that. Like, cool. Like it usually doesn't raise to that level, but if it's like, and if it's like the 5th time it's happened in a game or the 3rd time and you're like, wait a minute, I feel like you're really trying to like scumbag me.
Or if it comes down to the last life point.
Yeah,
and
it's like
your opponent thinks you're dead and you don't.
Yeah, and you're
it's the point where you would call a judge over, and then you would,
try
one
to
of
figure
you
it out.
or both of you would, yeah.
So just like talking through, and like it's good to just like when you write it down, announce, and then that's where you can fix the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because usually it's pretty low stress to be like, oh, we were off a point or we were off 2. And like, oh, you didn't write this down, or oh, that creature had lifelink, so I'm actually at 22, not 20.
Right. And like this is where communication is key also, because if you have been communicating with your opponent, it's a lot easier to fix these changes than if all you've done is grunt at your opponent and then there's a life total discrepancy. It's going to be a lot harder to fix because like one or both of you hasn't been very, communicative.
Yeah.
Up to that point.
Yeah. We've already talked about like asking to move to combat. Like just being clear with that. That is, I think, probably the biggest like place where confusion happens. Either someone didn't realize it, saying okay, move them to declare attackers, or
right.
They tried to do something and they were still in the main phase.
Yeah.
Right. So like just being clear like where you are when you're doing your thing before you go to like around the first main phase to combat transition.
Yeah, and if you had listened to the last episode, you knew that like where some of those tips and tricks and like little edges can be had. So
yeah,
it's important to be clear, especially around those little tips and tricks and edges.
Yeah, and then okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like I had mentioned previously, especially if there's things in the format that like are likely to come up, I like to give a little bit of extra time there. It's pretty common for your opponent to do things during your upkeep. So a lot of times I will untap, and then even if it's not like noticeable for my opponent, I'll pause for a second before I draw my card just to make sure that they have an opportunity to say something too.
Yeah. If you're doing any kind of like shortcut, be specific. So this is one I talked about last week. There's a difference between move to end step or move to cleanup.
Right.
Right. And like end step, they have a chance to respond. Cleanup, they don't.
Right. And like there's more to this also, because you can, like say you're mana screwed or whatever and you draw your card and you can't do anything for your turn and you just say pass the turn. Like, I mean, you're shortcutting a huge portion of your turn. You skipped your main phase, your combat phase, your main phase, your end step, and now you're in cleanup.
Yes.
So, like, if your opponent wanted to do something in between there, like, they need to speak up. Or if you're the opponent and you specifically wanted to do something, at a specific point, you need to say during your main phase 1 or during your combat step or before you leave, main like, phase 2 or whatever.
Like on, they're like, move to cleanup. You're like, well, okay, on your end step.
Yeah.
Right. The problem is, right, that when someone says something, we typically acknowledge it with like, okay or yeah.
Right.
And if you don't immediately follow that with like what you want to do,
right,
you have agreed to what they want to do.
Yeah,
right?
I mean that's another really important point. I know, in some higher level events, when I'm trying to process information, I will say okay. So my opponent casts a spell, I will say okay, and then I'll think about what I want to do. That kind of gets murky when you're playing a blue deck with counter magic. Because if your opponent casts a spell and you say okay, acknowledging that they're casting the spell, and then you're thinking about what counter spell to play, and then they play something else, like you never told them you wanted to stop, you just agreed that they're casting their spell, and the shortcut okay means okay, it's good.
Yeah. It means it's basically they're saying, does questing beast resolve? And you were like, I am acknowledging that you asked me this question.
Right.
But you just said, okay. And they're like, oh, so I asked, does questing beast resolve? And he said, okay. So questing beast is on the board. Well, actually, we're like, I need to think if questing beast resolves.
Right.
And like, so like, I know what I've played against like heavy blue control decks. I'll just cast them. I'm like, does this resolve?
Yeah.
And the people will be like, I'm thinking about it. And you're like, okay, cool.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool. And they might not have a counter spell, but they're thinking if your spell resolves. Right.
That's right.
But it's just like the way we're programmed, like as Americans to communicate with whatever it is. Someone says something, and you're like, oh yeah, or okay, and then but that means something in game language, and you have to like try to be mindful of being precise with your words, right?
Yeah.
It takes a while to kind of like turn on the like, okay, I'm playing a Magic game now. I need to like really dial in and figure out like what I need to say. You know, even if it's like questing based, and you can just be like, give me a minute, like 1 second, right?
And like we said, a lot of this stuff, like at FNM level, you're not going to run into, major timing issues. It's really not a super big deal to like unwind. So, like
especially
as you're listening
small.
to us, as you're listening to us talk through this stuff, don't think that like everyone's out to get you and everyone's trying to gain these small edges. But it's important to know that this stuff exists so that, if you're trying to up your game a little bit, you can keep this stuff in mind to try and, be more clear or, play at a little bit higher level.
Yeah, I mean,
than what you normally would.
I've definitely used the move to clean up.
Yeah.
In a situation where I was like, I kind of need my opponent to screw this up.
Yeah.
Like, like playing for cash in like a 9-round like legacy like tournament, or I'm sure I've done it like in a team event where like I'm trying to make sure that like it's like I do the best I can for the people beside me, and I'm like, go to clean up, and they're like, okay, and then they're like, I'm gonna cast a spell, and I'm like, no, you're not. They're like, what do you? I was like, like I discarded my card. There is no more turn.
Right.
Like playing like Reanimator, and you're just like on the draw, and you draw your card and go to clean up, or Manaless Dredge. Yep. And they're like, okay, and you throw your card in the graveyard, and then they go to do something, and you're like, no, we went to clean up. I discarded my card. We're done. I feel like, if it was a situation where where one, we weren't like leveraged and needed to do really well,
right,
and two, I hadn't already discarded my card and given that information. If they would have been like, okay, I'm going to cast whatever, and I hadn't discarded my card, it's like, okay, like, do your thing.
Right.
But, yeah, but I think, these are things you can do, and some of them, like, sometimes you are trying to get, like, the 1% or, like, 0.1% slight advantage.
Yeah.
Right? But most of the time, it's just like, I can't do anything. Just go. Like, I've got 7 cards. I've got 4 forest and 7 white cards. Like, just put me out of my misery.
Right.
Right? As opposed to, like, I've got to try to, like, get an edge. So, we already talked about this next one, which is use pen and paper for life totals.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So, one, if there is ever comp REL, again, right, you have to keep your life totals with a pen and paper.
Correct.
Right. So, using the 20-sided spin down die that they give you is not good, because if someone bumps your table and it rolls over, now you've lost life totals.
Right.
And we already talked about...
There's no way to look it back up.
Yeah. And we've already talked about the fact that it's a running tally, and you can go back and see what the life total should have been.
Yeah, look at where the discrepancy is and try and recreate it from there.
Having pen and paper lets you take notes, like if you cast a Thoughtseize or a Duress, you can write down your opponent's hand.
Yeah, just like how on Arena, after you've seen their hand, like those cards stay visible.
Yeah.
Same thing. You're kind of doing the same thing with pad and paper.
Yeah, and then you can like mark off what cards you have seen.
Yeah.
Like,
it also works well for like they've been doing some more stuff with tucking cards in libraries as of late. They kind of started with like Approach of the Second Sun and Teferi, where like you put a certain number of cards down from the top. Sometimes when my opponent is playing effects like that, I'll like try and keep a tally as to like where that card is. Because in your library, you can't just leave the card face up like they do in Arena, so you know where it is. It has to be face down in your deck.
Yeah.
So like just making tick marks for like each card that's above it and crossing the ticks off is usually how I do that.
Also, if you are taking notes, your notes are public information.
Correct.
Right? So you can't like take notes and then hide them from your opponent.
Yep.
Right? They have to, like, if you're taking notes, like, you don't have to like hold up your piece of paper and show them. But if they're like, hey, what are you writing? You have to be like, oh, I'm writing, whatever. How many, like, you've got 4 more cards before you hit your approach.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Right? Like,
Because I feel like there's a story there. Was there, like a big to-do about that at some point?
Not that I know of. I just know that has always been something that, like, I have heard from, like, our judge friends. Yeah. That, like, you can't have hidden notes.
Yeah.
So, also, like, energy and poison are things that you need to track via paper.
Yeah, you can't just use a die. Like you said, if somebody bumps the table and the die rolls around, then you have just lost the tracking of that.
Yeah, that used to not be the case. In college we tracked energy with dice all the time.
Oh, 100%.
To the point that Jacob Ba got an energy token as his the token he had made for winning the invitational.
Yep.
It
was pretty deep in the format where they made that rules change.
Yeah, I think there were too many times that, like, it was just like random, like, energy discrepancies. I thought I had 8. I thought you had 6.
Yeah.
And, like, it mattered because they could activate something twice as opposed to once, or 3 times as opposed to 2 times.
So I have one more weird thing to add to this energy thing.
Okay.
Not that it's going to come up super often, but in case anybody ever plays Pioneer again and there is an energy deck there, both players are responsible for tracking both players' energy.
Fun.
Like, per the rules, if your opponent is playing an energy deck, you and your opponent are both responsible for keeping the total.
Yeah. Again, this is one of those things that, for the most part, it only ever comes up if there's, like, a wild discrepancy.
Yeah.
Right? I personally never tracked my opponent's energy. Maybe I should have been, but the problem with energy is you got such big numbers so fast.
Yeah. I think that I had a problem with this once, and a judge had told me that I was responsible for tracking it, so I started.
Okay.
I don't remember what the story was, but I don't think that I would have just randomly started tracking my opponent's energy.
Yeah, unless you were told, like, hey, you need to track your opponent's energy.
Yeah, and I definitely remember, like, tracking my opponent's energy on, my life pads. Actually, I could probably pull out a life pad within 5 or 10 minutes of right now.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I got rid of my, like, I had a nice hardbound notebook that I went through tons and tons and tons of life totals.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, using the pen and paper, if you are, so inclined. I know people that would, like, track their win-loss record.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I usually do that. Like, if I'm using a book, like, throughout the course of a tournament, I will absolutely write down, like, usually what I'll do is I'll write the round number. Once I figure out what my opponent's playing, write down whatever deck they're playing, and then I'll circle either my life total or the end of each game so that I can figure out, what round I won.
Yeah, like, you don't want to be at the end and be like, oh, wait, I thought I got it 2-1. What do you mean you got it 2-1?
Yeah.
Like, even, like, something as big as who won game 1. You forget.
Oh, yeah, I've forgotten before.
Yeah, so,
were you there that night at that F&M?
I don't remember.
I think it was Mr. Sowards.
Okay.
We were on game 2 and finished, and he started packing his stuff up. And I said, "Where are you going?" And he said, "Well, I just won 2-0. And I said, "No, we're 1-1." Or he goes, "I just won 2-1." And I said, "No, we're 1-1. We've only played games." And he was like absolutely insistent that we had played 3 games. and I knew for a fact we only played 2 games, but we were both using dice, so we couldn't look it up in a notepad. I had to pull somebody from the next table over, hoping that they were paying attention, and they confirmed that we only played 2 games, but like he was dead set that we had played 3 games and he won.
Yeah. Like, these things happen, right? There's a lot to process. So just like having the crutch of pencil and paper is important.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we went from shortcuts through the turn to take good notes. It was an abrupt change.
Yeah, that was kind of weird, but
yeah. But like, I mean, even something like, I worry about, oh gosh, like dungeons, right? They're like, track it with like a glass marble from 1997.
Right.
Right. A glass bead, right? And it's like, well, what if someone hits the thing and like there's a big difference between like drawing a card and like draining for one in the Mind of Fandelver.
It doesn't matter because there's no competitive play anymore.
Fair, right? But like still, like just like keeping track of that and like, oh, the table got bumped. Where was the thing?
Yeah.
Right. Like you did it you ventured on turn 3 and on turn 6, and now it's turn 10 or 12, right? And you don't remember exactly where it was.
Right.
And it got moved, and you're like, oh man, I guess I don't know where I was.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, well, I have this goblin token, so I must have done that one.
Right.
Right? And you're like, oh.
It's a lot harder to determine, like, if you had scryed or not, though.
Exactly. Like, do I know the card on the bottom of my deck? You can't, like, go check that.
Right.
And, like, normally it's just out of my head. It's like, well, I put that on the bottom. Right, this is why I have a 55% win rate. Is like, I like, I'm like, what did I put on the bottom? Some cards. I don't know. I didn't need it 4 turns ago. I don't remember what it is.
It wasn't relevant at the time, so it left.
Yeah. 65% win rate. They're like, my 4th card from the bottom of my deck is as follows. And it's like,
yeah,
I see. Yeah. Gotcha. Sorry, Rain Man. I got other things going on my head. I don't need to know what time Wapner's on. I'm good. There's like a reference and a reference that is 1,000,000 years old there.
Yeah,
People
we're
are
old, it's all right.
Are currently Googling, what is Wapner? Can I buy this at Burger King? No, you cannot.
Yeah.
Before Judge Judy, there was Wapner. So like we said, a general rule of thumb is just like be clear and communicate. And if you do that, for the most part, you are going to get the same back.
Yeah,
right?
like kind of like I alluded to earlier when, I had talked about like a life total discrepancy being resolved pretty easily if you have both been communicating well versus if neither of you have said a word to each other, all of a sudden there's a problem. That's a lot harder to fix than like if you're both pretty open about everything from the get-go.
Yeah, you can get it fixed and it won't be a big deal. Like I said, it's often the feeling of like, do I think this person is like trying to treat me fairly?
Right.
And if people feel like you're trying to treat them fairly, they're gonna like work with you if a mistake comes up.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but if
I've certainly played against opponents where I felt like I was not being treated.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
At large events.
Yes, I mean I vaguely remember his name. I don't want to say his name and like get it wrong. But there was that the Legacy event where so I was on Depths and then my opponent was on like Naya Renin 6 like land deck. It was the Team Lotus Box deck.
Yeah.
And like had already like had some communication issues and then like tapped 2 mana to activate a blast zone and didn't look down and picked up the wrong blast zone.
Right.
And picked it up, tapped it, put it in his graveyard. And like he wanted to pick up the 1/2 and he picked up the 1/1.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, cool, blow up your exploration.
Yeah.
And like he didn't get to go back.
Right.
right? Because he wasn't paying attention and like wasn't like I'm gonna blow up my blast zone on 2, right? It was just like activate blast zone and picked up the wrong one.
Mm-hmm.
And if you would have said on 2 and then picked up the 1-on-1, I'd have been like, all right, dude, you picked up the wrong one. Right. But instead, he was just like blast zone and thing and didn't realize he made a mistake until I was just like, okay, cool. Like brain fart, like blow up your thing. And then he was like, oh, wait, no, why would I want to do that? I don't know.
I don't know. You did it.
You're the semi-pro player.
Yeah.
I'm just the guy. I don't know.
I'm just the casual tryhard.
I'm just a casual tryhard here, just like trying to like 20 people and going to time for some reason.
That's right.
But yeah, like, if I'd been a little more forgiving if it had been like, oh, like we were like there was reasonable communication throughout.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like the second or third time that I thought like they were trying to get like by on me.
Yeah.
And it's like,
So there is one thing that kind of fits with communication here. And it is kind of weird that this like show kind of morphed from shortcuts to communication, but they are pretty tightly linked. I don't remember if I saw it on social media or something, but the topic of chalice checking came up lately.
Yes.
Do we want to talk about chalice checking quickly, especially since like Modern is kind of in the spotlight on people's minds?
Sure, as long as we can also get through this other stuff we have in the notes, because I think it's important. But we'll do the chalice check. So what was coming up in social media?
Just like how people felt about chalice checking, whether you felt it was okay or not okay, or if it was something that was to be expected, or if chalice checking is scummy, or
okay,
have you.
So, for the uninitiated, welcome.
Yep.
Chalice of the Void is an artifact from Mirrodin Block? I think, or Scars.
Yeah, it was either Mirrodin or Fifth Dawn.
Yeah. So, it's XX for an artifact that comes into play with X charge counters on it.
Mm-hmm.
And when a player casts a spell with convert a mana cost X, you can counter it with Chalice of the Void. A trigger, like you have to trigger Chalice of the Void to counter the spell.
Right.
So, a chalice check is when you cast a spell that you know your opponent can counter with their chalice, and you're checking to see if they're going to, say, trigger.
Remember. Yeah.
Right? So all you have to do when your opponent casts a spell with Chalice of Void, basically Chalice triggers every time a spell is cast.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it does, and then it checks to see if it's the right CMC. Or it might just... No, it just triggers when it's the right CMC. But you just have to say... You have to see that you have one counter on your Chalice, and they cast a spell with a 1 converted mana cost, and you just have to point at your Chalice and say trigger, and then they put it in the trash can.
Yep.
Right? But but personally, again, like I'm from an older, timey version of Magic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think it's 100% okay to, like, cast a spell into your opponent's Chalice.
Yeah, that's exactly where I fall. I will chalice check my opponent at every opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, now there is the Galindo chalice check, and then which really stretches across the line, which is right at the line, right? But like the number of times I have forgot and accidentally cast a spell into a chalice, seemingly for a chalice check. Is pretty high.
Yes.
Right? I just the other day cast an exploration with a Narset out. Like I had planned my whole turn for whatever card I'm gonna draw with this exploration, and then nothing happened, and I went, oh, shame scoop. Okay.
Yep.
Like I was losing this game anyway, but now I'm really losing this game. So yeah, like I think it's fine to chalice check someone. Right? I mean, a lot of times, the chalice is in the deck, and that's like why your deck works.
Right.
Right? Like, the number of times in a Legacy tournament someone's playing in day 2 with soldiers or dinosaurs or pirates or whatever, and it's just because it's a deck that has 4 Chalice of the Voids, and like, I don't know, 17 times they stuck it on turn 1.
Yeah.
And then they won like 16 of those games.
Right.
And it was like, cool. It doesn't matter what my other cards are. I like dinosaurs. So I'm going to play
Stompy.
I'm going to play Dinosaur Stompy. I like soldiers because First Strike is secretly unbeatable in Legacy. So I'm going to play Soldier Stompy and play 4 Chalices and a bunch of 2-drops.
Yep.
Right? Like, I think it's fine. Like, the reason those decks work is because they have a Chalice. Like, the person should, like, be like, the only reason I'm playing this deck is because of this card. I should be paying attention enough to, like, actually, like, say trigger.
Yeah.
Right? Now, the Galindo Chalice check is, like, the all-in-one motion, like, play this, Glistener Elf, go.
Yeah.
Where
2 things that resolve, 1 thing that doesn't pass turn.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like Blighted Agent, Glistener Elf, go.
Yeah.
And your opponent's like, okay, I'll go. And then, like, they realize that there's a Glistener Elf on the battlefield. that one sometimes is a lot close to the line to over it.
Yeah. I don't know if I quite go that far, but I have absolutely Chalice checked people multiple times during the same game, though.
And, like, had your stuff resolve.
Yeah.
Right? Even
or
if,
had
like,
it not resolved just to see. Like, it's not doing me any good in my hand.
Yeah, like, just to, like, you know... Sometimes the Chalice of the Void only works 33% of the time.
Yes.
Right? So, or sometimes Chalice of the Void is Sex Panther. 50% of the time it works every time.
That's right.
Right? And so, like, if you're going to lose a game, and, like, you're not cheating. You're just asking your opponent, like, hey, do you remember what cards you have on the battlefield?
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's almost no different than, like, I don't know, attacking, like, your 2-2 into their, like, 3-2.
Yeah.
Or into their 3-3. Like, you're, like, are you going to block? Like, you were at 2. You have a 3-3. I'm attacking my 2-2 into it. If you just say no blocks, you lose the game. Are you going to block? Like, I don't think that's a scummy move.
Right.
Right? Like, I mean, we've all had the arena game where your opponent, like, attacks and you, like, make 3 blocks and they concede. Right? Because they had nothing else.
Right.
You're like, okay, you're throwing 3 creatures away. If I block any 2 of them, you lose the game. I will block 2 of them. And they're just like, okay, we're dead.
Yep.
Right? So, like,
basically
I don't know.
The same thing.
Yeah. I think it's just like, hey, are you going to, like, make the game action you have to make?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's fair.
Yep.
Now,
I agree.
So, and again, like, with Chalice, like, tying it all together with communication, you have to communicate to your opponent that I am acknowledging that my Chalice of the Void has a trigger, and I am saying trigger, and then that makes you put the thing in the trash.
Right.
Right? Now, Cameron was playing, oh gosh, like Red-White Prison or like Red-White Nahiri. Right? Yeah. Blood Moons, Chalice of the Voids, all this stuff. And he's playing against Tron. And like day 2 of the Team Star City Open in Baltimore. Right? And we're like, it was our last match or our second to last match. Like, we were like, I think dead for money.
Yeah.
Or something. But we were just playing to like see where we would finish, right?
Right.
And
well, because like I think you were dead for money, but you still could have had like a very respectable finish.
Which we were like 16th or 17th or something.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And we were playing against this team from Canada, and they were just like having a blast, loving life, right? And Cameron gets to the point where, like, he's got a Blood Moon out, he's playing against Tron, and he taps 10 mana and puts a Chalice of the Void on 5.
Yep.
Because he knows his opponent has a Batterskull.
Yeah.
And I turned to Cameron and I said, if you miss that trigger, you have to walk home. Like, we all know why you put it on 5. You tapped all your mana. If there is a Batterskull on the battlefield at any point in this game, you have to walk home. I'm sorry, these are just the rules. You have to go home.
Yeah.
I think my opponent was playing Burn.
Mm-hmm.
I remember this part of the tournament very well. But I was just like, you've got to go home. Right? So, all right. So another kind of so we said err on the side of like over communication, but there is like a point where you go too far.
100%.
If new players do this and it like kind of drives me up a wall, I know it's like their best intentions, right. But it's like my life only has so many minutes.
Please don't take them all.
Yeah. So
when they're like, a few left.
They're like, I'm gonna tap my swamp for black, and I'm gonna tap my swamp for black, and I'll tap my plains for white, and I'll play, I don't know, something this one black. I'll play Liliana of the Veil.
Yeah.
It's like, how did you get $100 Lily if you say I tap my swamp for black? It's like, just grab 2 swamps and a plains and tap them.
Right.
Right. Now, that attitude of just grab your appropriate mana and tap it means you as the like non-active player has to be paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
Right. To like make sure that they tap the right mana. And like, you know, this has definitely happened where like stuff has slid through, but like you don't need to like every time you tap a land announce the color you're tapping it for.
Yeah.
Even if it's like a breeding pool or an underground or an overgrown tomb that taps for 2 colors of mana. Like if you tap 3 forests and a swamp for in an overgrown tomb for a spell that costs 3 and a black, I can infer that your overgrown tomb was tapping for black.
Yeah.
Right? Now, if you're like, you know, if there's a Cavern of Souls, right, and you're playing Eldrazi.
Yeah, right? This is kind of important.
Right, so if you have a Thought-Knot Seer that costs 3 and 3 generic and specifically 1 colorless Wingding, right, and you have a Cavern of Souls, you should say, like, I'm tapping this Cavern of Souls for a color of mana.
Right.
Because that
otherwise it doesn't work.
Because it makes my Thought-Knot Seer uncounterable. Because you could also just tap your Cavern of Souls for a colorless mana.
Right.
Right? And so there you have to communicate, like, hey, I'm getting, like, green from this, so I can cast this spell. Right?
Yeah.
But for the most part, you don't have to, like, clearly announce what color you're tapping your lands for. Now, if your opponent's like, hey, I don't see, how do you have the mana for this?
Mm-hmm.
Right? You should be able to be like, okay, I'm getting blue from this, green from this, you know, whatever, right? Like, just walk through, like, hey, you know.
What you're doing.
Yeah, like, if you cast Niv Mizzet Reborn.
Yeah.
And, like, they're like, wait. Like, do you have all 5 colors?
Yeah.
You should be able to go, like, here's white, here's blue, here's black, here's red, here's green.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's that. But,
yeah, I mean, that's totally, like, a reasonable thing to ask.
Yeah.
It's not, like, don't feel scummy for...
Yeah, but, I mean, maybe in the Niv Mizzet Reborn case, you're, like, here, white, you tap, like, you're, like, white, black, or white, blue, black, red, green, Niv Mizzet Reborn. But if it's just, like, you know, here's my Acererak.
Yeah.
And you're, like, as long as you tap a thing that, like, makes black... Like, they should be following along. But if they're not following along, like, it's well within the rights to be like, hey, how did you cast that?
Mm-hmm.
But you don't have to announce every tap, right?
The only other place this might be a little confusing, or where it's important to like tell your opponent or be a little bit more clear, what mana you're using, is when you're floating mana. Like if you mana more colors and then cast something, and then you need like the blue from the Manamorphose for a spell, like 2 spells from now, or if you like Dark Ritual and then cast some other stuff and you need a black mana from that Dark Ritual down the line.
Yeah, so
then it's important.
If you're usually going to do like one of those big mana generation turns, I think now you're supposed to like track your floating mana.
Yeah, you are.
So if you're like, again, on paper, I know I have some Arcade Post tokens somewhere that are all the different colors of mana.
Yeah.
So like if you're storming off, you can be like, I've got 5 black, 2 red, and a blue.
Yeah.
And I'm going to cast another Dark Ritual, so I'm going to go down to 4, up to 7.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and track it that way, so it's clear how much mana you have at every point.
Right.
But for the most part, like unless you're like, hey, I'm going to try to cast 25 spells this turn.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You don't need to be tracking like all of your mana at like every point.
Yeah, like one more place where that's important is like if you're playing Amulet Titan, because like your mana can get kind of constrained and there's a whole bunch of taps and untaps in the middle there where you're not necessarily off cast 10 spells, but like you need certain colors to activate abilities. So like when you're tapping your mana and using mana, again, like you said, at that point you should probably be tracking it on paper or with some sort of counter or something. But like that's another point where you would need to make sure you're extra clear with your opponent what mana you're using for what.
Yeah, like if you have a Simic Growth Chamber and you're like, tap for blue green and I'll play an Ancient Stirrings and get a, find a Teleria West.
Right, and then go to transmute the Teleria West.
Yeah, it's like, hey, where did that blue mana come from? Or like you do that and then you like play another Simic Growth Chamber and it comes in, it gets untapped, and then you tap it and then bounce it back to your hand. A lot has happened between when you generated that blue mana and when you used it, right? You looked at the top 5 cards of your library, you played another land, you had a trigger, you untapped it, you tapped it, and then you bounced it to your hand. Like 6 things happened. And then you're like, oh yeah, use that blue mana.
Yeah.
And, just like, if you've like written it down, it's easy to see.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what was your other one here?
So that's the exact opposite of that is, instead of going, in depth with announcing every little thing that you also don't want to be the guy that just kind of looks around and like motions. So if you draw your card for turn and then just tap your creatures, does anybody really know what you're doing other than you? You could be activating an ability, convoking a spell, attacking. Like you haven't actually communicated anything with your opponent.
Yeah.
I think you had an opponent at like a large event that did this, right? Where he just like grunted and pointed.
No, this was again the Legacy GP. He we talked about him before. Red Black Reanimator player just like took a Chancellor of the Annex and like flipped it over at me and kind of like chucked it at me, and I was like, oh, so this was him communicating that he had a Chancellor of the Annex that I was gonna have to pay 1, right? And so it was just like he didn't say anything. Like it was like pulling teeth to get him to like talk at all.
Yeah.
And it's like, I mean, you're playing Red Black Reanimator. There's not a lot of talking. Like hit the Grizzlebrand button, but still, at some point, like there's gonna be some communication,
right?
So, it makes it hard to know like what's going on, and like another thing is like it does slow the game down, like you attack. And then you go to second main phase, and you just, like, look at your opponent.
Right.
It's like, well, you're the active player. You're telling me what's happening. And so you're just sitting there holding priority, not communicating. And then it puts the and then you put the onus on like your opponent to be like, are you done?
Yeah.
Right? And, then you get all mad. I can't believe this person's rushing me through my turn.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, well, you sat there for a minute and didn't do anything.
Right.
Like, what were they supposed to do? Just like, see if you like grew moss? Like, no, like we need to move this puppy along. So there's a thing of like going in the tank and like, when someone's in the tank and really thinking hard, right? Usually they will, there's clearly a reason as to why they're thinking so hard.
Yeah.
Right? Or they're like, you see them like mouthing, counting or whatever.
Yeah.
But like if you
just your fingers or whatever.
Yeah, if you're just like standing there or sitting there just staring at them and they're like, what is going on?
Yeah.
What is happening?
Yep.
All right. I had another one that was good, and I was saying, oh, we should totally touch on this.
Oh, what was it?
I don't know because I finished my other thought, and like I'm old, and I can't keep two thoughts in my head at the same time.
I feel your pain.
Yeah, it was about, oh gosh.
Was it about mana?
I was talking about tanking, and it was like related to that. Oh, I don't remember. Oh no. And it was a good point too. No. But yeah, just make sure that you let people know what's going on, because you can't just sit there forever and ever.
Yeah.
And not do anything.
I mean, I think we've touched on it twice already this episode, but as long as the lines of communication are open, things will be fine.
Yeah.
Just communicate to your opponent in the same way that you would expect them to communicate with you, and they're more likely than not will be no problems at all.
Yeah. So, with that and my inability to remember a good point, I think we have a show. Oh,
I think we have a show.
I guess we can do one quick arena newsy thing.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Which is, they just announced it like on Monday the 9th, but Jumpstart on Arena is getting pushed back like 2 weeks. So if you...
For some reason, because they want it to be like super close to rotation, so we can buy a whole bunch of Jumpstart at the same time we're buying Midnight Hunt for some reason.
Yeah, so if you're like listening to the podcast and you're like, why can't I play Jumpstart? They just tweeted out today that they are pushing it back a couple weeks.
Yep.
So, just so you know.
FYI. The more you know.
It's bad that we both did that. All right. So now, officially, we have a show.
Yep.
If you realize what I forgot, you can tweet at us at CasualTryPod if we'll get to it next week.
Yeah, if you remember. Or if you have a way for us to, you can hit us up on Facebook at CasualTryHardMTG, or you can shoot us an email, show@tryhardmtg.com. Like I said at the top of the show, we have a TCG player affiliate link. Appreciate it if you use that with just singles to help the show out. tcg.casualtryhardmtg.com. Also, our pre-show for this show was fantastic. You patrons are going to be super happy with it, I imagine. It could have been a show all unto itself. Unfortunately, we're under a time crunch to try and get this playing in paper series done, and it will probably be irrelevant by the time that happens. So if you want to listen to it, hop on over to patreon.com/casualtryhardmtg. A couple bucks in the pot. Get access to all of our pre-shows. You'll get access to our show notes when they go live. I'll have to go back through and check, but I'm probably about due for another Patreon get-backs at some point coming up here. So if you wanna be involved in that, like I said, hop on over to patreon.com/casualtryhardmtg. Throw a couple bucks in the pot. We appreciate it. Yeah. And we have a Discord. So there's a link in the description. There's a link on all our social media. A lot of cool people hanging out in there, talking about decks, talking about new sets, asking questions. It's a great place to go to get some questions answered. Or if you have show topics like things you want to learn how to do in paper, that's another place where you let us know.
Yeah. So with that, we'll hopefully catch you at F&M.
We'll catch you at F&M.